Our next speaker is Phil Woodward, who is now assistant professor of philosophy at Niagara University. His research is in the philosophy of mind and philosophical anthropology, focusing especially on the connection between consciousness and various other aspects of personhood, including intentionality, rationality, and agency. During this academic year, 2021 to 2022, he's a residential research fellow at the Henry Center for Theological Understanding, where he's co-authoring a book with Tim O'Connor entitled Human Persons, A Contemporary Philosophical Scientific Synthesis. His publications appear in journals such as Australasian Journal of Philosophy, Canadian Journal of Philosophy, Philosophical Psychology, Philosophia Reformata, and Sophia, as well as in volumes published by Wiley Blackwell and Routledge. So let's go ahead and welcome our speaker.
Thank you. Let's see. The center of gravity is over here, I guess. It's a real honor to be here. I want to thank Josh for inviting me. We've been quite the distinguished lineup of speakers. I'm a bit of a departure from that. So what I'm going to present, my training is in philosophy of mind and philosophy of psychology. This is in, and I'm not a scientist or a theologian. I'm going to be talking about personhood and drawing on the sciences. A lot of this material is pretty new to me, so I'm hoping that I learn as much from you as you do from me today. So, yeah. Okay, so let's jump in. The concept of a person has an interesting history in the Western intellectual tradition. It's not found in Plato and Aristotle. It gets developed in Greek by some of the early church fathers in connection with Trinitarian controversies. And then Boethius takes some of the emerging notion of personhood in Greek, translates it into Latin using the word persona, and gives a definition which then becomes sort of canonical for the next 1,000 years, that a person is a individual substance of a rational nature. The importance of the notion of personhood has only grown, I think, in the subsequent Western philosophical tradition. Through Middle Ages, through early modern period, through the Enlightenment. I think it's central to our civic institutions today. So I think there is a kind of inherited, a received view, and I'm going to call it the traditional view of human personhood, that has emerged from this tradition. So it's got a metaphysical dimension and a moral dimension. Okay, the metaphysical dimension, humans, because rational, are as different from all animals as all animals are from plants. So a couple important things about this metaphysical dimension. One is that rationality is central. So there have been some departures from this as the orthodoxy, those who have, and certainly other capacities have been proposed as augmenting rationality and notions of personhood, but nevertheless it's remained pretty central. But it's understood in a lot of different ways, some of which we'll talk about. And also, this is supposed to mark this really dramatic kind difference. So a rational animal is a different way of being an animal. It's not just a distinguishing feature, as every species has its distinguishing feature. It's supposed to be this whole other way of being an animal. Moral dimension, humans in virtue of this difference in kind enjoy a fundamental difference in moral status. So this metaphysical difference, that's a deep kind difference, and rationality is the difference maker, also makes a moral difference of some sort. Now, my focus isn't going to be entirely on the metaphysical dimension. I'm not going to talk about the moral dimension, really. There have been those of late who have tried to capture the difference in moral status while rejecting the metaphysical dimension of the traditional view. And I just don't think that those approaches work. So it's not that the moral dimension doesn't matter. I think it's the whole point, really. But you need the metaphysical dimension to make the moral dimension work. So that's going to be my focus. So my aim is going to be to give an account of human persons that underwrites this metaphysical dimension of the traditional view that is consonant with our best contemporary science. That's my goal. And I recognize that I'm swimming upstream here against the current. I think the tide has turned against the traditional view. So Darwin marks a turning point, I think. Famously, he wrote in The Descent of Man, "There can be no doubt that the difference between the mind of the lowest man and that of the highest animal is immense. Nevertheless, the difference certainly is one of degree and not of kind." Now, he says certainly. Darwin was launching the whole field of evolutionary psychology. It wasn't like he was reporting on well-established science, right? This is an assertion somewhat ahead of the data. But I think that Darwin would be pretty comforted by what comparative animal cognition, what evolutionary psychology has discovered in the subsequent, century and a half. Just about every behavior that has been pointed to as the, uniquely human, you can find some analog of it, at least, in animals, okay? So I recognize there's a challenge here. All right, so here's my plan. First, I'm going to talk about what I mean by rationality, what I think it is about, what the ideal of rationality is that makes persons special, basically. And then, from there, I'm going to imagine evolutionary development sort of from the perspective of a kind of engineering problem, thinking of building up a mind from our most rudimentary minds that we know of, so the vertebrate mind, through the mammalian mind, and finally to the human mind, to try to trace some continuities and see if there are any significant breaks, okay? And then finally compare what we've come up with at the end of that process with that rational ideal that I discussed at the beginning. Okay, so that's where I'm headed. Okay, so the rational ideal. Going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, there's this important distinction between theoretical rationality and practical rationality. Basically, roughly, theoretical rationality is aimed at the production of beliefs that make sense, given the subject's psychological set, what evidence the subject has, that sort of thing, okay? And practical rationality is aimed at the production of actions that make sense, given the agent's psychological set, roughly. So, the initial question to ask is, what's the gold standard here? What's the good stuff? Which of these is the thing that's supposed to be so important? And different thinkers have gone different directions. So here's two representatives of the two camps. So Aristotle, he's on team theoretical rationality. So he basically thinks that practical rationality is for wartime. It's for solving problems. Whereas, if you don't have to do that, what do you do with yourself? Well, you're free to use your intellect. And in particular, to use your intellect to contemplate. Theoria. This is the highest expression of human rationality, or rationality at all. It's apprehending the truth that you understand, basically. Okay, it's a kind of cognitive apprehension of reality. That's the highest thing. And that sounds pretty good to me. That's cool. I'm glad we can do that. Okay, but Kant, he tells a very different story. So Kant, when he's talking about what underwrites the dignity of human persons over against the price that non-persons have, right? So he's talking about a difference in moral status. He points to moral autonomy as the distinguishing mark. That is, the ability of persons to regulate their actions not according to what they want exclusively, but according to what they believe is right. That's moral autonomy. Self-regulation according to what's morally right. I think that sounds pretty cool too. Persons can do that. Great. Okay, so how should we think about this? Well, I think there's an even more general way to think about rationality that encompasses both of these, that explains what's the appeal of both. So think about this. Contemplation, Aristotelian theoria. I think its appeal would be lost if there wasn't something lovely, wonderful, valuable about the object of contemplation. If ultimate reality were just kind of ugly or dull, I don't think that there would be much appeal to this, okay? So this suggests that what's in common here is that rationality is about apprehending and properly responding to value. And Aristotelian theoria is, contemplation, that's one way, that's one proper response to one kind of value. And moral autonomy is another proper response to another kind of value, or maybe a whole set of values, okay? So for short, I'm going to say that the ideal of rationality is being a custodian of value, a sort of comprehending caretaker of value. That's my view. So now, what does a being have to be like in order to be a custodian of value? What sort of capacities or endowments does such a being have to have? Well, it won't surprise you that certain cognitive capacities are necessary for rationality, in my sense. First of all, a rational being needs to know what is valuable and according to what priority ranking. Remember, I'm talking about the ideal here, attaining the ideal. You've got to actually know what's valuable, and insofar as those values can be measured according, against each other, what the ranking is. Second, knowing how to respond appropriately. So what is the proper response? Insofar as the proper response involves some kind of means-ends reasoning, right? Doing something that brings about an effect. One needs to know what the range of actions are that one can take. One needs to know the causal structure of the world. So one needs to have at the ready the space of reasons. What explains what causes what, and what calls out for what, basically. Okay, so pretty expansive cognitive endowments here to be a custodian of value. It might surprise you that I think there are non-cognitive endowments required. So affective endowments. The fully rational being desires to respond and delights to value, right? And delights in doing so. So if you don't love the good, you're not rational in my sense. You're not fully rational. You're not a custodian of value in the full sense. And also volitional capacities are needed. So the custodian of value freely and consistently chooses to respond appropriately to value. That is to say, not automatically, not as a sort of mechanical reaction, and not piecemeal or erratically, but in this kind of systematic, free way. Okay? That's the picture of the rational ideal that I'm going to be working with. If we're persons, it's because we can do that stuff. Okay, so now let's leave aside ideals and start talking about organisms. So caveat here, this is a heuristic exercise. I'm not saying that all and only vertebrate minds are like what I'm going to describe. So this is something of an ideal model, but I do expect that there are considerable analogs in both ontogenetic and phylogenetic processes that are going to track this heuristic engineering process that I'm going to describe. Okay. All right, so the vertebrate mind. I think the vertebrate mind can be understood according to this triadic structure that I just introduced. I'm not going to call these cognitive, affective, and volitional capacities because I want to save those terms for something closer to, what we recognize as human cognition, sort of cognition full stop. So more generally, I call these C capacities, A capacities, and V capacities, which these are categories broad enough to encompass something very rudimentary and also something very sophisticated. Okay, so the basic vertebrate C capacity is sensation. That's the ability to register environmental stimuli, basically. Something inside the organism tracks changes outside the organism. And then A capacities, primary emotions. This is language from affective neuroscience. So these basic affective goads or motivators: hunger, thirst, pain, fear. And then the basic V capacities are just the production of adaptive behaviors. So you've got this circuit, sensory inputs, affective goads, resulting in the production of appropriate behaviors. And if you've got a system that's got enough feedback and plasticity, you get associative learning. So, right, input in tandem with an affective goad results in a behavior that doesn't actually satisfy the desire. Oh, change course. Or that does satisfy the desire. Okay, reinforce that, right? Okay, so that's it. That's the basic picture. I think it's possible to hold in mind a complete model of the vertebrate mind, this very rudimentary psychology. Okay, so mammalian mind. How does this update the vertebrate mind? So upgrades to C capacities. The first one is that sensation is transformed into perception. And the difference here is that this isn't just the registering of the stimuli, it's the representing of the stimuli. So now the world seems to be some way, right? Now we have, in effect, conceptualization, not just internal states that happen to track that are indicators of the external states, but that seem to represent it, seem to present a world to the organism. So there's basic conceptual capacities, which cognitive psychologists call core cognition, like object, quantity, space, cause, and agent. These categories that are going to structure perceptual experience for the animal. Also, there's this whole other system of, this is what psychologists call executive functions. This is 2 of the 3 canonical executive functions. Show up in mammals. A third will too, I'll mention it later. working memory and cognitive flexibility. So working memory is the ability to hold information in mind and manipulate it. So here we have mammals have the capacity to deploy these concepts, not just in perception, but offline, right? To actually be able to sort of process of information offline. And then cognitive flexibility, the ability to consider alternative possibilities. So the ability to treat identical stimuli as markers of different underlying causes because of contextual clues. That's an example of cognitive flexibility. Or having a range of different behaviors at the ready that can be deployed in different contexts. Okay, so together, right, you have working memory or offline deployment of concepts, and this flexible, sort of distance, cognitive distance from the environment. And this is a form of rudimentary intelligence. It's not very impressive by human standards. Disjunctive syllogism, A or B. Not A, so B. That might be about the upper bound of mammalian problem solving, but it is a form of problem solving. So I think it's not an abuse of language to call it rudimentary intelligence. Okay, so that's the upgrades to C capacities, right? Perception and also some kind of system of cognitive control. Upgrades to A capacities, you get secondary emotions: grief, fear, empathy. These are significant. Think about empathy. So a mammal sees another mammal in distress, and as a consequence, it's in distress. Or a mammal sees another mammal that it likes, and consequently, it feels good. Okay, something really new has happened, and that is that the internal states of another animal become motivationally salient to the first animal. So this is how you begin to get social behavior, right? So social emotions come into the picture here, where I'm motivated to act, an animal's motivated to act because of what's going on with another creature. Okay, so then what about V capacities? Here you get the third of the canonical executive functions, inhibitory control. So this basically means delaying gratification, at least narrowly understood, delaying gratification, which mammals can do not very well, but they can do it. But more generally, what it refers to is the need for this cognitive control system, this working memory, cognitive flexibility, to be able to intervene on the sensation behavior loop, right? Because if an animal is just going to act on whatever affective goad it's got at any one moment, well, then it doesn't really matter if it can problem solve, right? So inhibitory control is a modification to its V capacities in that now thinking, intelligence, problem solving can be sort of in the driver's seat of behavior, not just affective goads. Okay? That's the mammalian mind. Again, I think it's more complicated, but I think we can sort of get the picture. What about the human mind? Okay, well, I'm going to develop this in 4 stages. The first 2 stages are just differences of degree, quantitative increases, although that result in some importantly new qualities. But still, this is just more of the same. But once we get to step 3, I'm going to say there's a break here. Something significant has changed. Okay? So first, accumulation stage. So all I mean here is a greater power, increase in, upping the faders of the mammalian capacities. This is the first kind of stage in this, building up the human mind from the mammalian inheritance. So first, we have increases in cognitive flexibility, greater capacity to entertain alternative possibilities, and especially, one that's especially significant, is mental time travel. So this is, again, a term from cognitive psychology, and it refers to both episodic memory, so the ability to hold in mind concrete past episodes, and also imagining future possibilities, again, as concrete episodes, particular episodes that are possible futures. So here, what's possible once you add this is just a whole lot more, a greater capacity for learning that goes beyond mere association. Right? You can remember what happened, and you can anticipate what you're going to do, right? That kind of thing, to a much greater degree than mammals can. I should say non-human mammals, but let that just be understood that that's what I mean. Okay, and then increases in social cognition, especially joint attention. So illustrate this. Imagine you are playing with a toddler, I'm picturing my 4-year-old. I'm on the floor with my 4-year-old. And he's got a toy that he is playing with. So he's playing with the toy. He's attending to the toy. I'm also attending to the toy. That's not the whole story, right? That's not what it is to play with a toddler. I'm aware of him attending to the toy. And, he's aware of me attending to the toy. And if I stop, he knows, right? He's going to rope me back in. So there's this interesting, and this seems to be basically distinctively human, capacity where it's like we have this mental state that's shared. I'm attending to him attending to the thing. And that is reciprocated. So this is pretty complicated. And it makes possible certain kinds of, this seems to be implicated in pretty much all human intersubjective interaction, this kind of joint attention. Okay, so cognitive flexibility increase, especially mental time travel, and new capacity for joint attention, underwriting greater, much more interesting social interactions. What about A capacities? Well, there seems to be an increased weighting of social emotions. So this is related to some of the things from the previous talk. So it does look like human children, at least compared with chimpanzees, have a much greater motivation to attach, to help, to want to interact, and to do so in a way that is sort of respectful and fair. I mean, of course, they're also a little, well, I won't finish my sentence. Anyone who has children know that there's another side of the story. But there does, compared to chimpanzees, there just seems to be, the social emotions seem to have this much greater weighting. So put that together, and what you get, again, this is just sort of accumulation stage, right? It's still just more. You get a propensity for communication that ultimately is expressed in symbolic language. So just let me say a little bit about this. If we're communicating, if I'm making a bid to communicate to you, it's important to understand that this is more than me simply sending a signal to you. What's happening is in order for this to work, you have to discern that I intend for you to attend with me to the thought I'm having. That's communication. It's actually really complicated in its sort of the social cognition involved. So you have to be able to discern that I intend for you to jointly attend with me to some thought. Then communication can happen. So you have to have all that stuff that I just described. At least you have to have the social cognition and the propensity and the salience of the social emotions to get this propensity for communication that then, where symbolic language starts to fill out the details. Okay, that's so much for the accumulation stage. Those are the things that are the faders that are increased in human beings. Okay, so the ampliative stage. Here what I mean is, once you get these capacities at this high degree, they start to interact in really interesting ways. And that's where you start to see exploding human capacities. You see the leap, right? I still say it's a difference in degree, but there's this kind of nonlinear feedback looping, virtuous interconnections among these capacities. So in the context of C capacities, there's an important feedback loop among social cognition, so attaching, interacting, that sort of thing. Language use, so starting to pick up on these noises and deploy them, and concept acquisition. So here's the thought. Language is cool because, unlike core cognition, I don't have to grasp the meanings. This is a different kind of representational system, right? Core cognition, I just grasp these basic concepts, right? Language is symbolic and communal. So the meaning of each word is determined not by my mind, but by the community. So I can piggyback on the usage of the community. I can use words, I can even use systems of words, like the number sequence, right? The sequence of numerals, counting sequence, in ways that I don't understand yet. And then as I use these things in the context of the social interaction, the lights start to go on. I start to grasp the meanings to a certain degree, maybe initially a little bit, then start to master them. Well, then once I master these new concepts, well, then I can start to ask about them, right? And then I can be taught about them in the context of the social arena. And the result is this explosion, this full conceptual human conceptual repertoire, which is just, exponentially greater than that of our closest living ancestors, or relatives, right? Any primate, just exponentially greater. As well as beginning to see explanatory and inferential relationships among these new concepts, right? Which gives an entree into the space of reasons, starting to understand what is a reason and how, thoughts can be related to one another. Okay, so this is this ampliative effect. Okay, acapacities, another really interesting ampliative effect, is a feedback loop between secondary emotions, especially social emotions, like empathy, but not exclusively, and this new conceptual repertoire. So, first of all, we get this tertiary tier of emotions, constructed emotions. These aren't emotions that you get just sort of, the humans have just guaranteed developmentally, the way that the primary and secondary ones are. These are constructed according to particular representational states. So, for example, I can be anxious about giving talks in front of people. Right? That's not an emotion. That's a constructed emotion, an emotion that's got this representational content. Primates can't have that because they can't, think about that stuff. Okay, so you get a tertiary tier that's constructed. Then there seems to be this fascinating pivot where the emotion itself comes to have representational content. So, for example, I see my sister walk in the door and I feel elated. It was so great to see my sister. Something more is happening besides just I have a feeling. I'm representing my sister and I have a good feeling. Right? What's happening? I'm seeing my sister as good. Right? My emotion itself comes to be a way of manifesting value. Right? So emotions transform and themselves come to be, in humans, representations of value. This is one theory of how we get our normative and evaluative concepts in the first place, is that mammalian emotions are getting sort of transformed into representations of value. They're a way of seeing value in the world. And once we got the value concept, we can use it offline, outside of the context of any particular emotional experience, and then this can feed into problem solving, thinking, and so we can begin to engage in moral deliberation. Okay, this is starting to look, kind of Kantian, right? We're moving in a direction of something sort of recognizable as human psychology. Okay, so what about V capacities? Well, okay, we've got this massive expansion of inputs. Moral deliberation, ability to plan, to strategize about all sorts of things, be able to think about all this stuff, right? Plus a new behavioral time scale. So now it's possible to, make choices relevant to possible concrete episodes in the future, right? Because we got this mental time travel thing. And now what we get is a new kind of output. Not behavior, but intention. Well, maybe mammals are capable of intentions, but they're going to be proximal intentions. They're going to be intentions to act here and now, right? Whereas the human V capacities now include distal intentions, like the intention to get on an airplane tomorrow, or change careers in a decade, right? Or standing intentions, the intention to learn more about evolutionary psychology than I currently know, right? Okay, so you get different outputs of the volitional system. Okay, so we got complete conceptual repertoire, entree into the space of reasons. We've got value concepts and beginnings of moral deliberation, and we've got intentions of any sort based on any kind of inputs. Right? Pretty cool, right? There's one capacity that is not greatly expanded. This is kind of surprising. Working memory is not greatly expanded. Now, it is expanded. Certainly, human working memory has greater capacity than chimpanzee working memory, but not exponentially, just a little bit. So it's still this cognitive bottleneck. So you might wonder, how's this supposed to work, right? You've got inputs of any sort to volition. You've got the space of reasons available to you. You can think about anything, but you can barely hold 7 bits of information in your mind. How's this supposed to work? And the workaround, if I'm thinking again, so sort of engineering metaphor, is secondary modularization. Secondary modularization. So the language of modules A lot of animals have dedicated processing modules for particular tasks that they need to do. So scrub jays have a dedicated cognitive module that helps them remember where they put their seeds, right? But it's not like they can just remember generally anything. And this is just comes as part of the natural development for scrub jays. But secondary modularization is the process of sort of programming your own mind, automating inference and behavior. So it turns out that humans are not actually that great at reasoning. We make lots of mistakes. We're kind of lazy and sloppy. This probably has something to do with the limitations of working memory. But when we interact with others, we give reasons to one another. We start to learn basically habits of mind, and then these things automate. So, and similarly with behavior. So, I could do anything right now. What are all the possible behaviors open to me? And what are all the potential reasons for acting? This is crazy, exponential, huge explosion of possibilities. And yet, I don't do that kind of deliberation very often. Most of the time, my behavior is driven by these habits that I have cultivated. But on the basis of grasping good reasons to act. It's just that then these modules get created that sort of automate thinking and acting because I just don't have a processing capacity that is sort of isomorphic with the scale of reasons I can understand. Okay, are we there yet? Almost, but we're not there. I want to say, so this is human psychology. I think we've gotten to human psychology, but that's not quite having a rational nature, or so say I. Something's missing. What's the thing that's missing? Well, to try to motivate this, here's a quote from Robert Spemann, a German philosopher. Human beings exist, he says, by distinguishing their being from their specific way of being, their specific nature. Their nature is not what they are, pure and simple. Their nature is something that they have, and this having is their being. Okay, what does that mean? He's saying something like this. I've got a psychology. Is that my nature? No, my nature is in my relationship to that psychology that I have. Other creatures, they just are that psychology, right? But a human being there's some sort of distance that the human being has on his or her own psychology. And that's as far as we get here with this quote. But some sort of thought that there's a different relationship that the rational being has to his or her psychology. Christine Korsgaard, ethicist, Kantian ethicist, says something similar. She says, we do not merely have intentions. I think she could have put in a number of different attitudes there, cognitive attitudes. We don't really have intentions, good or bad. We assess and adopt them. We have the capacity for normative self-government, or as Kant says, Kant called it autonomy. And this distinctive character of human action gives us a whole different way of being in the world. So she's going further. She's saying, we don't just have these mental states, we adopt them, and that relationship that we have to them marks some really distinct, some big chasm, a difference in kind. Okay, what is this difference? Well, what Korsgaard says the difference is the capacity for self-consciousness. And she's not unique in positing self-consciousness as really important for personhood. This goes back at least to John Locke. But what self-conscious, so lots of people say persons are self-conscious, that's a necessary condition. But what exactly that means, it gets understood in a bunch of ways. So first I'll tell you what I don't mean by self-consciousness. I don't mean higher order consciousness or introspective attention. That is just one conscious state that sort of is aimed at another. Maybe that's a kind of self-consciousness, that's not what I mean. I don't merely mean self-concerning attitudes. So think about a squirrel that wants that nut over there. It wants that nut for itself, right? So even just very basic affective states of attitudes of animals are going to need to have includes some implicit self-other differentiation. But that's not self-consciousness in my sense. Nor is it merely the possession of an I concept. It's not like you just take the conceptual repertoire, add one more concept, boom. Though I suspect that only self-conscious beings can at least deploy and maybe even possess an I concept. But self-consciousness is the deeper phenomenon. So what is it? Well, my proposal is that self-consciousness is a new level of consciousness. So this is language, again, this is from cognitive science. The paradigmatic example of differences of level of consciousness would be the difference between wakefulness and dreaming. So maybe tonight you go to bed and you have a dream that you are watching Phil Woodward's talk and feeling critical of it. All the contents are exactly the same as what you're experiencing right now. Nevertheless, very, very different state of consciousness, right? It's not a difference in content, it's a difference in level, this other thing. Okay, so what I want to suggest is that the difference between a self-conscious being and a non-self-conscious being is as big a difference as the difference between just waking consciousness and dreaming consciousness. So it's a kind of, it's the lights going on inside. It's a coming home to oneself as a psychological being, becoming aware of one's subjectivity and agency as such. And this is sort of primitive type of self-awareness. Okay, so that, I say, changes things. But it's not merely the addition of this capacity. I mean, why would that be so important, right? It's rather that what's significant is the way that new capacity transforms and integrates the whole, this whole psychology that we've been talking about. So to get the idea here, imagine some sci-fi scenario where a human being has had his or her self-consciousness suppressed. So, lives a life, has thoughts, has desires, forms intentions, et cetera, has memories, and then one day the evil scientist is conquered and the lights go on. What would it be like to be such a being? In one sense, such a being would think, well, I guess those were my beliefs and thoughts and desires and so forth. But in another sense, there might be the sense of alienation. I didn't adopt those. It's as though they were just sort of happening to me, right? And presumably there would be some of such a being's attitudes that he or she would want to identify with, and others that he or she would want to dispense with. So self-consciousness is a catalyst for this diachronic process of autonomous self-construction. Now, for the self-conscious being, their psychology is up to them in a new way. It's theirs in a different kind of way. Now, this process of self-construction, right, making commitments, that sort of thing, is one that does not necessarily succeed. And I think all of us know that we have some discordance within our psychology, right? We're sort of two minds about things. But that process can't even get going without self-consciousness. Otherwise, even human psychology in all its richness is this sort of passive thing that just happens. That's the picture. Okay, so now I'll conclude by returning to my rational ideal and comparing what we built up to with that rational ideal. So, again, thinking of this as an engineering challenge, you try to start with vertebrates and try to build a person. What do you have to do? Well, again, these were the endowments that we talked about, or that are necessary for the rational ideal. You need to construct an ideally rational mind which knows what is valuable and according to what priority ranking, knows how to respond appropriately, desires to so respond and delights in doing so, and freely and consistently chooses to so respond. Okay, so I'm going to walk through each of these and see sort of how we've done. What's the strategy? What strategy is available or sort of has been put to use? So knowing what is valuable and according to what priority ranking. Well, here's the strategy. Repurpose mammalian emotions as representations of value. That's not quite the same as knowing what is valuable and according to what priority ranking, but that's at least the sort of basic conceptual framework needed, right? We've got ways to represent value, at the very least. Okay, knowing how to respond appropriately. So this one's sort of complicated because this is where you get all the sort of sophisticated cognition. So first, repurpose mammalian core cognition in tandem with outsourced linguistic meanings, thereby expanding the representational repertoire indefinitely. So get the capacity to think about anything that your community can think about, basically. Repurpose mammalian problem-solving capacities as general-purpose reasoning abilities. Once you've got those, you've got expanded cognitive flexibility, you've got this huge conceptual repertoire, okay, now much greater capacity for thinking about pretty much anything, and for thinking about thinking about reasons, right? And finally, expand and calibrate these abilities by training automated cognitive modules, mental habits. That's how you get something, is that knowing how to respond appropriately, being able to strategize? Well, okay, at least have this sort of basic infrastructure, right? Desiring to so respond and delighting in doing so, well, join the affective system with this jerry-rigged cognitive system that I just described, creating a new tertiary tier of emotional responses, including appropriate emotional responses to what's good, right? At least we have the kind of psychological materials to be able to do this. And finally, freely and consistently choosing to so respond, repurpose mammalian inhibitory control as bona fide free agency, empowered by self-consciousness and expressed in the training of automated behavioral modules. Okay, so is a human a person? You might say barely. That might be your reaction, which might be sort of disappointing. You might think being a person's being a rational animal, individual substance of a rational nature. And this is it, this is sort of cobbled together. So that might be your reaction. You might think this is kind of disappointing. Here's another reaction. I guess I have either reaction depending on the day, but another reaction might be at its first shot, evolutionary development generated persons, right? Like nothing was wasted. This is an extremely efficient repurposing of pre-rational psychology, sort of leveraging all of this to clear the bar, or maybe making it possible. Okay, so let me just kind of sum up here and conclude. So to be a person, I say, is to meet a rational ideal, apprehending and responding appropriately to value. I don't do that. You don't do that. Right? That's an ideal. So possessors of human minds are not, by that very fact, persons. But they have the potential to become persons. They've got the requisite psychological endowments to make the journey to becoming a person. And this potential to become a person, to become a custodian of value, marks us as distinct kinds of things from our non-human terrestrial companions, despite our sharing so many of their psychological endowments. Thanks.
So I'd like to start by thanking Phil Woodward for an excellent presentation. I found Phil's paper to be engaging, well-argued, and quite informative. I personally learned a lot from reading it, and I'm excited to hear more in the Q&A, which I'll kick off now with a couple questions of my own. So first, let me say that I agree with Dr. Woodward that since the concept of person is a moral one, it's unclear whether the metaphysical dimension of one's view of personhood can be framed in isolation from the moral dimension. If a person is, as philosophers tend to say, a being that's owed moral consideration, or one that has a certain kind of moral status, then any satisfactory and non-arbitrary account of personhood must provide conditions of personhood that are appropriately connected to those moral notions. And this is exactly what we find on Phil's theory of personhood. It's our being custodians of value, normative notion with various metaphysical prerequisites that makes us persons. But included in those metaphysical prerequisites for personhood, according to Woodward's account, are various cognitive, affective, and volitional capacities that are not enjoyed by all human beings, something he alluded to near the end. This leads me to my first question, which is really just an invitation to say more about the implications of the account for what are sometimes called marginal cases of agency. A frequent objection to the traditional view that persons are individual substances of a rational nature concerns its exclusivity. Right? Given the view's stringent demands for counting as a person, it seems to rule out many human beings who we think should count as a person. There might be, I didn't put this in the comments, there might be like theological reasons for thinking this, but also as Agnieszka Jaworska and Julie Tannenbaum say in a passage that Woodward cites in the paper, common sense tells us that all human beings, whether adults or infants, whether cognitively unimpaired or severely cognitively impaired, have full moral status, and certainly a higher moral status than most animals. So there's apparently some tension between common sense and this traditional view. One response is to say that all humans have at least the potential to become rational in the required sense, and that this potential suffices for personhood. Now that opens up a whole can of worms about the nature of potentiality. We can set aside those issues here, I think, because it seemed to me that Woodward wanted to go in a different direction, arguing that all human beings are potentially persons, but not that all human beings are persons. So my first question is, could you say a bit more about this concern about exclusivity, and in particular about the implications of the theory of personhood for human beings who lack some of the capacities discussed? And then I'll be very brief here, but my second question concerns, in particular, the volitional capacities that Woodward takes to be central to personhood. In particular, in a couple places, Woodward says that the ideal person performs free actions. And I'll admit that this might have stood out to me because of my own interest in the topic of free will, but in any case, I wanted to hear more about Woodward's conception of the connection between personhood and freedom. On the one hand, there's something natural about the idea that persons are agents who possess a certain sort of freedom, and several philosophers have endorsed that sort of view, but it also seems that an agent could possess the various volitional capacities that Woodward explicates in the paper, including self-consciousness, normative self-governance, and more, without exercising free choice. So my second question is, what exactly is the connection between personhood and free action? And if we were to discover, or maybe conclude based on philosophical reflection, that we human beings lacked free will, would this imply that no human being is a person, or at least fails to reach the ideal? So I'll leave it there. Thanks again. I look forward to hearing more.
Yeah, so thanks, Taylor. So I'm not going to have a lot to say about these things. I'll say a little bit. So first, regarding these marginal cases of humanity, the first thing that I should say is that I actually think it's probably just a verbal difference. Those who want to say anyone with the capacity to be a custodian of value is a person, versus I'm saying anyone who is a custodian of value, who actualizes those capacities, is a person. So, I'm happy to attribute moral status, or to say that moral status is grounded in the capacity for being a custodian of value rather than the actuality. My use of person here, I got this from C.S. Lewis. I mean, he's just sort of my inspiration here. It's something that one of the spirits says to one of the ghosts in The Great Divorce is, when you've grown into a person, it's all right, we all had to do it. I kind of like this idea that personhood is not a threshold, but it's an ideal. It's the thing toward which we're ordered. It's the telos. I don't know. But again, it's sort of poetic as far as that goes, because I think it's a notational variant of a view that says to be a person is to have capacities for this ideal. Okay, but that doesn't answer everything. You could still say, well, look, there are humans that don't have the capacities, and that's right. This came up in the Mark Cortez's talk last night, that this is a worry that people have of the structuralist views of Imago Dei. And I confess I'm just not that worried about this. What you need is the relevant notion of potential. You need some notion of potential, which I think is going to be connected to proper function. And this is a notion that we deploy all the time, and we have a sense for what it is for a human being to be properly functioning and a human being to not be properly functioning, disease. So what you need is some notion of proper function. So for a fetus, say, what is proper function? It's proper development. So if we have some notion of proper development, we have some notion of impairment, well then I think we have what we need to include these marginal cases, because we say they're impaired or developing persons, or beings with capacities. So I'm not a bioethicist, so I don't have really worked out views here. I'm sort of trusting that the bioethicists are figuring this out. And the best that I found is this bioethicist, David Hirschenow. This is a paper written with his spouse, I gather, called A Morally Relevant Potential. I just discovered this guy. He's at SUNY Buffalo. He's what he writes about this. This month I find compelling. Maybe I'll encounter an objection next month that I don't like. But so he says, A healthy human fetus has the potential to realize mental capacities that are of considerable value and will enable it to flourish to a considerable extent. Our contention is that the morally relevant sense of potential, that's the thing that is needed. Morally relevant sense of potential is determined by what is healthy development or proper functioning for things of that kind in their design environment. The potential of a healthy human fetus is to develop a mind of great cognitive and affective abilities that will enable it to enter into various rewarding relationships with others and exercise a range of cognitive skills that enable it to think and act in valuable ways, unlike any other kind of living being. So I like that view. I mean, this is for fetuses as one kind of marginal human. Other accounts would have to be given for other types of marginal human. But anyway, I pass the football to future bioethics or something. Let somebody else or lateral this. But I'm not, since it's such an intuitive notion that there's such a thing as proper function and impairment of function. I don't expect that this is going to be totally elusive, even though it's hard to work out the details of what the relevant notion of potential is. So, regarding free will, I think all persons have free will. If you use the other version, you say all persons have the potential for free will or something like that. I think it falls out of my account, but I don't know. So here's a thought. Reason's responsiveness plus indeterministic spontaneity plus self-consciousness equals free will. So I didn't talk about spontaneity. This is the subject's ability to bring about an effect that's not just riding the wave of cosmic causes, but that's just an intervention into that stream. And I think that mammals have the capacity for spontaneous doing. That kind of indeterministic, spontaneous agent acting, agent doing, in tandem with reason's responsiveness and self-consciousness. That might just be free will, but I don't know. I'm not an expert, so you'll have to tell me whether that's sufficient, but maybe at least necessary conditions. So, okay, so that's all I have to say about that.